the reason that you can have a huge sort of social media kind of kerfuffle over whether or not someone says something kind about President Biden, and you don't see these sorts of battles about the Trinity or about the humanity of Jesus, is because that's what people really care about.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Mike Cosper, Russell Moore, and I talk with The Atlantic's Pete Wehner about the latest snafu at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission and political differences that create fissures in our church communities. Next, Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle resigns in the wake of the Trump assassination attempt, revealing a growing institutional trust crisis in our culture. Finally, Chris Seipel joins us to talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu's latest visit to Washington and its implications for American politics and the war in Israel and Gaza. It's an episode of Heavy Hitters. Welcome to the show. This week, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention announced the dismissal of their president, Brent Leatherwood, and then quickly corrected that error. As details came to light, it became clear that the decision to terminate Mr. Leatherwood had not been a collective choice, but instead the unilateral decision of the board's chair, Kevin Smith, who has since resigned. While the catalyst for this surprising chain of events hasn't been made public, the scent of political disagreement is in the air. Now, this news is within one particular denomination, but we know that other faith communities are struggling with similar difficulties, namely how to address issues of political difference without creating deeper fissures in the body of Christ. This isn't just a story about the SBC. This is a story about populism in the church. Joining us to talk more about this is Pete Wehner. Pete is an author and a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. We're always grateful for his insights and presence with us. Pete, welcome back to The Bulletin.
Thanks for having me.
On Monday, a press release announced that Brent Leatherwood, who has presided over the ERLC since 2021, had been dismissed. This coming directly on the heels of his comments in support of President Biden's exit from the race. He had written that he commended the aging president on his choice to step down from running for re-election. Mike, talk to me about causation versus correlation here. Was this just sloppy decision-making and communication, or is it more than that?
I think at the moment that's a difficult question to answer because we haven't quite gotten to a place where there's a great deal of transparency about what catalyzed this. There's been a lot of speculation. To an outsider looking in, there are some signs that appear obvious as far as what may have catalyzed certain things. You know, a couple of things that we do know. Kevin Smith, who was the chair, who was responsible for attempting to terminate Brent Leatherwood and then subsequently has taken responsibility and resigned. Smith does not have a reputation as being a big MAGA guy. Hasn't been somebody who's necessarily sort of beaten the drum for those kinds of politics inside the SBC. So there's a lack of clarity around exactly what was happening there. And hopefully we'll get more transparency. Leatherwood has actually communicated that there's more to come. And of course, there are people on both sides of this conflict around the ERLC, people who were advocating on both sides of the conflict for sort of radical transparency.
Jimmy Buffett once said, "Some things are still a mystery to me, others are much too clear." And so I'm not as mystified as Mike is about some of the issues needing to be clarified. Unfortunately, as former president of the ERLC and having lived through the whole world there, I'm a little conflicted out because I know everybody involved. Most of the people involved I have hired at some point or the other. But let me tell you, typically, the way that such things happen in the SBC is that what appears to be some sort of populist kerfuffle usually has an elite or two behind that and using the populist kerfuffle in order to make something happen. I've been in those situations as president of the ERLC many times where the convention very supportive, very successful convention, and then these backroom maneuvers take place between conventions, between meetings. That's the reason I left. But I've never seen it done this poorly. I was in absolute shock that there would be a press release put out about the firing of a president, first of all, by the trustee executive committee, which does not happen in Southern Baptist life. Then to find out the executive committee was down to only 4 people. Then to find out that there was no formal meeting, no minutes, and that the chairman just had done this apparently on his own. I haven't seen that level of incompetence in a long time, and here's the main thing that I was worried about in all of this. Not worried about Brent. Brent will do fine, but the question is, when you do something like this and you put out a statement, "Oh, we have suddenly fired the president," the immediate thing that people assume is, "Oh, there must be a real backstory here about the character and morality of the figure involved." I've lived through that, and I said to Brent Leatherwood, "You know what? 50 years from now, you're probably not gonna care about any of this, but your kids will still be here, and you need to make sure that they know that you have not been involved in anything immoral." And that's the implication that they'll often leave, and I was very angry about that, to the point that my wife, Maria, said, "I literally, in 30 years of marriage, have never seen you this angry." The machinations behind it are very clear to me. The way it was carried out is a mystery.
Mike, not every denomination has an ERLC. Could you tell us how it functions within the denomination and what might be the equivalent for folks who are not Southern Baptist, who are in smaller denominations or collectives of churches?
The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, and there's a lot of money that goes into the convention, and it goes into the what's called the cooperative program, and then the cooperative program funds a number of institutions that are educational institutions, mission boards, international missions, North American missions, church planting, that sort of thing. One of these institutions is the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And this organization basically exists to advocate on behalf of Southern Baptists, both on a legal and legislative branch, for advocating for public policy, doing educational initiatives around ethics and public life, and serving churches, to equip churches to respond to social issues, to advocate in their own communities, to raise up leaders that can do that sort of thing on a local level. In some ways, it's unique, I would say, in Protestant life, in that it's a reflection in some ways of just the fact that the SBC is so darn big, they can afford to have an institution that does this kind of work, that does this kind of advocacy, that's engaged politically in really significant ways. The day after Brent Leatherwood was not fired, he was in Washington, D.C., meeting with leaders, including Benjamin Netanyahu. They have a significant voice within the political realm as a result of that. That's why it's such a hotly contested institution, particularly at this moment. And over the course of the last number of years, it's been increasingly contested because there has been a growing divide inside not just the SBC, but there's been a growing divide inside evangelicalism of what political advocacy, what political witness should look like. And kind of that divide between sort of the populist right and a more sort of classical liberal pluralist vision of conservatism, that's, I would say, at the heart of what's driving the conflict around the ERLC over the last number of years.
Pete, you've had your finger on the pulse of both the church and politics for a long time. Surely you have seen other churches respond similarly to leaders in situations like these. What does the fallout look like for churches who are having these kind of conflicts?
Several things stood out to me about how this unfolded. One was just the cultural dysfunction that was manifest here. This is just not the way that institutions should operate, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. And I'd say the other thing, just to put a kind of broader frame around it, is this is part of a whole series of events, some individual, some institutional, that's happening within contemporary Christianity in the evangelical world, that if you're an unbeliever that are watching this, you have to think that this is a kind of freak show, moral freak show, and an institutional freak show. They're seeing this stuff happen. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you think about where is the fruit of the Spirit in how all of these things are going on. Some of the manifestations that we're seeing are outright scandals. Others of it is just acrimony and antipathy and relational breakdown. But when you take all of it together, I think it's just a terrible witness for the Christian church. And I have talked to a lot of pastors, and one of the notable things that I've heard from them is how the political divisions, the political conflict is spilling over into churches and into relationships. So it's not necessarily that all the churches are having fights over pro-Trump and anti-Trump, but there are certain sensibilities that are being shaped, a kind of anger, a quick trigger, people leaping to critical comments, a lack of grace, or a failure to believe people are acting in good faith. And that seems to be, I think, plaguing churches and in some situations crippling churches. So I took what happened at the ERLC and the SBC as just another data point or a brushstroke in a portrait that's increasingly ugly and disturbing.
When I grew up in Royal Ambassadors, which is kind of our Southern Baptist Boy Scouts teaching us what it means to be a Baptist, what it means to support missions, one of the sort of urban legends that we were taught that turns out to be like George Washington with the cherry tree is that John Locke observed a Baptist congregational business meeting and sort of built his views of classical liberalism and democracy on the basis of seeing democracy in action in a Baptist church. That's not true that happened probably, but the metaphor worked in some ways to say that the ways that we live together in these smaller communities affect us and change the way that we see the bigger sort of reality in civic life. Right now, that is working backward, where congregational decision making is reflecting what is happening in terms of national political campaigns. And as a matter of fact, if you see the reason that you can have a huge sort of Twitter or social media kind of kerfuffle over whether or not someone says something kind about President Biden making a decision to step back into private life, and you don't see these sorts of battles about the Trinity or about the humanity of Jesus or about some of these, is because that's what people really care about. And as one of my former ERLC staff members said to me the other day, the real danger is not with getting out of sorts with the actual confessions of faith and creeds, it's with the unstated creeds. And I said, yeah, because often the unstated creeds are what they really believe. And you can see what people really care about. And often what they really care about is partisan political identity. And that's why it reaches this level of emotional turbulence. And that's happening all over the place in almost every denomination. It doesn't just happen on the right. I've talked to very liberal Episcopal pastors and Presbyterian pastors who say, look, our congregation, we all get along politically, but we're in turbulence because everybody wants their particular political view to be made central and that the pastor reflect back the requisite amount of anger over whatever that particular political view is. That's a dysfunction in American life. And Christianity ought to have the theological, spiritual, and relational resources to stand against that and to counteract that. And we're seeing that we don't.
If someone's listening and they say, I think that's me. I think that I've gotten myself mixed up here in enmeshing religion and politics. How would you encourage a person to separate themselves, to be able to discern between what is a populist mindset, what is a patriotic mindset? Where should these distinctions lie for them?
Part of it might be tuning out the news a little bit. Politics makes a poor substitute for religion because it offers a poor source of meaning. It's an answer that might sound a little Sunday schoolish, but I don't apologize for it. I think part of the answer as well is the spiritual disciplines, worship, reading the scriptures, go for a walk, touch grass, play fetch with a dog, do something other than being dialed in and tuned into the news 24/7. Because one of the things that it does is when you pull out of the endless sort of doom cycle of news and politics and perpetual outrage and perpetual conflict, part of what happens is when you inevitably encounter it again, the smallness of it, the pettiness of it, pales in comparison with the grander story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation that the church is a part of. One of the great things about the larger story is that it's easy to kind of pull back and go, oh, wait, the church has been here before. The church has been here a lot. In some ways, the country has been in moments like this before. It helps to sort of lower the temperature and lower the pressure. That's not to say Christians should just tune out of politics. We should be quietists. We shouldn't be engaged at all. But it's to say that there needs to be a sobriety to how we engage. And I think the liturgy of the church, the story of the gospel, is one of the most important ways that Christians can be sobered and build an immune system to the outrage that drives so much of our news cycle.
While there are many Christians who are very ready to be vocal about their political views, I imagine there are just as many who they don't even want to touch politics with a 10-foot pole anymore. They look at a situation like this in the ERLC and they say, this is why I don't talk about this stuff with my friends anymore. This is why I don't want to be engaged. Pete, how would you respond to someone who's sort of once burned, twice shy when it comes to talking about faith and politics, who is more likely to be isolationist or just retreat out of fear from these kind of conversations?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. The first thing is I understand why that fear, that concern, that hesitation is rooted in reality, because we are living in a time that's filled with a lot of conflict, and it's splitting families and churches and a lot of other things. The stove is hot, you don't want to touch it. So that makes sense. I think the caution that I would offer up is that for all the problems that inhere in politics, politics is fundamentally about justice and the pursuit of justice. It's always an imperfect pursuit of justice, but it's one of the places in which that plays out, and Christians can't be indifferent to justice. And it's not an abstract issue. When politics goes south, human lives can be decimated. I mean, we see that all around the world. And when politics goes well, it allows, in many cases, for human flourishing. And I get the sentiment that people have, which is a weariness, but the stakes are too high and the cost would be too high for people just to check out. I do think that there's almost quasi-religious quality to politics today. It's worth asking the question, well, why is that? And I think for Christians, part of the problem is that faith itself is not filling that void. The void is there, it's created. And so for all the conversation, all the Christian scripts that we talk to each other with, the Christianese, I just wonder whether for a lot of people, the reality of faith, the notion that having your heart won over to Jesus and to falling in love with him, and therefore having your sensibilities shaped by that, isn't happening. And so there is this enormous void, and a lot of things are going in to fill it. And I think one of them is politics. And one of the complicating factors, I would say, is that many of the people that most need to hear what Mike said wouldn't perceive what he said, which is this need for harmony, for peace, for shalom. I think what is happening is that you've got an awful lot of people who are exhausted and want that to happen, but you have a large number of people who seem to thrive on conflict and antipathy. It is, from what I can tell, almost life-giving to them. And I think they kind of live for this stuff. And this creates an imbalance, right? So if you're a peacemaker, if you're prone that way, if you're trying to move in that direction, and you're dealing with an interlocutor that doesn't want that and wants, in fact, to search for conflict, that just makes it really, really hard. And I think as Christians, we still have to act, as Eugene Peterson said, there's the Jesus way, not just the Jesus truth, but the Jesus way. But I think we just need to name what's going on with a lot of the people that are causing the splits in the country.
Russell, this is a lot of what you do with the after party, isn't it? Having these kind of conversations with folks. How do you respond to them when they come to you with questions like these?
There are implications that go really far out with this kind of thing. I just heard from a very significant Southern Baptist just this past week who said, I'm afraid I don't know which I'm going to walk away from first, the SBC or Christianity. And I said, don't confuse the first with the second. And the person said, it just all seems really lifeless right now. And I think that's key. I mean, there's a lack of genuine life and of the Holy Spirit that can cause people to stumble and to fall. And that's why it's so significant to have communities of people who have the fellowship of Christ, who are connected to something that is actually alive, someone who is actually alive as a head to a body, and who actually exhibit the Holy Spirit. And that means including the way that they think about and talk about how to relate to one another when it comes to these political questions, especially when Pete's and my friend Yuval Levin in his new book talks about the fact that what we have going on right now actually isn't politics. It's theatrical self expression. That's what is really important. So if you think about the big sort of get at each other's throats, split your church kind of issue, is really usually not over whether or not there ought to be an infrastructure package or whether or not this legislation should be passed or not. It's usually over, should someone have said that President Biden was selfless in stepping down? Or should they have taken this as an opportunity to take a shot at him as evil? Well, that's not about policy. It's not about politics. It's about let's express who we are. And so that has implications on people. And so when you have communities of people who might disagree politically, but who are able to say, nonetheless, we've got a bigger source of unity and a bigger source of mission and meaning, that communicates things even to people you don't see that are just overhearing the conversation, and that's what's important.
Listeners, the campaign trail is not our spiritual pilgrimage. The polling place is not our holy of holies. Our true life will never be found there. We will be right back. It's been almost 2 weeks since former President Donald Trump was shot at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, narrowly escaping assassination. As law enforcement and other experts have scrambled to identify the shooter and decipher a motive, one question has loomed above them all. How could a killer get this close to a modern day president? This week, the Secret Service came under fire in congressional hearings as lawmakers interrogated them about the sequence of events that led to this security failure. After an intense exchange with Republicans and Democrats as she took the stand, Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle stepped down. Pete, you've reported on politics for many years. Most of us are familiar with the role of the Secret Service when it comes to a sitting president. We see them surrounding him at public events. Does their service change at all when a person leaves the Oval Office? And what does the Secret Service detail look like for a former president?
It tends to be smaller, but it doesn't change in the sense that former presidents get Secret Service protection, which is what Donald Trump had. Now, he had, I think, in part because he's a candidate, but also just by nature that he served as president. But that's an important part of this country, the sense that what we owe people who have been in the office, not because of who they are, but because of what the office is and what the office signifies.
Russell, there have been a lot of accusations swirling concerning the Secret Service since that assassination attempt, namely that the inclusion of more women in the service and an emphasis on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion led to this failure. I want to ask the question that I suspect some people are wondering about, which is not just how did this happen, but did the Secret Service somehow allow this to happen, either through the sort of sin of omission or commission?
There are a couple parts of that that are ridiculous. One being that women can't serve in the capacity to protect presidents. When it comes to DEI, I mean, DEI is one of those things that was a legitimate conversation, but it's often being used as a substitute for not a white man. We see it used in incredibly racist and misogynistic ways right now. If there's a black pilot on a plane, oh, it's a DEI pilot. Or if there's a woman who's serving as a police officer, it's a DEI police officer. That kind of stuff just needs to be rejected out of hand. As should some sort of conspiracy theory that somehow the Secret Service actually wanted the candidate that they are protecting to be shot. That's the last thing that anybody wants, is to be implicated in a shooting on their watch. But what is an important conversation to have is, how is it that there could be this kind of a failure of competence, where you could have someone who's that close to the president, someone who is, from what we understand, doing drone surveillance ahead of time to map it out. How did they not know that? So people have every reason to wonder, wait, what happened here? And how do we put measures in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again? Now, what we've seen in the past is failures often lead to corrections and reinforcements. I mean, after the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 1968, and then the attempted assassination of George Wallace in 1972, there were a lot of conversations to say, wait, we need amped up security, not just for presidents, but for presidential candidates because of these kinds of threats. I hope that there will be this kind of evaluation coming out of this to say, let's make sure this does not ever happen again.
Pete, do you anticipate that that's the kind of evaluation we will see?
Often, what goes some distance toward defining whether an institution is healthy or not is what it does in light of failures or near failures. Does it have the capacity to correct, to self reflect? We're going to see with the Secret Service. I suspect they will. In my experience, it's a very professional organization, not a perfect one. And this does need to be put in the context. I mean, Russell mentioned some of these examples, King and Kennedy in 68, Wallace, Gerald Ford was almost killed, Ronald Reagan was almost killed. So there are actually fewer of these attempts than there have been in the past. And I think what people don't fully realize is the number of attempts that are thwarted. This is an extremely complicated issue. You've got a nation of 330 million people. The people who want to do harm have access today that they really didn't have in the past. It's a lot like intelligence agencies. You don't want to hear about them because when you do, it's normally because something bad has happened. So we shouldn't lose sight of the number of things that have not happened because there are good and honorable, conscientious and competent people in positions of authority.
Now, we've just seen Kimberly Cheadle step down. Do you think that's an appropriate response to what has happened here?
I would say until recent years, this was sort of the norm. When institutions fail, the people at the top of those institutions have to say, I'm responsible, I'm taking responsibility, and I'm now going to resign from this. We don't see that as often, I think, these days for a variety of reasons. I think that's an interesting topic in and of itself, that sort of lack of institutional responsibility. And I think it speaks to the ways that leaders view themselves and view their relationship to their organizations. And that's really unfortunate. I think it is a good thing. I think it is good for civic hygiene to see a leader say, this was a failure. I was in charge. I'm taking responsibility. I think it would be good to see more resignations. She was not alone in being responsible for what took place at that event. The fact that there's going to be an inquiry from the executive branch and a congressional inquiry into what took place here, a bipartisan congressional inquiry, I think that's going to be a good thing. I think it's going to be ugly. The congressional inquiry is going to be partisan, and you're going to see a lot of people vying for cable news hits over it. But nonetheless, that's an important thing for civic hygiene. We need some transparency to say, what happened at this event? What do we make of these conflicting reports about why there was or wasn't an appropriate level of care? How does this 20-year-old kid with a ladder, a gun, and a rangefinder get onto a roof and is there for several minutes to get a few shots off? And let's not forget, a man lost his life. A chief of a fire department, a dad, a husband, lost his life in this story. This is not just a near miss. I mean, this is a catastrophic failure that the Secret Service, having done its job effectively that day, someone would be alive today and there would be a couple of people who never had to go to the hospital. I think it's important that this is pursued vigorously to find out what can we learn from this? How can we prevent this from happening again?
The notion that if there is a failure, the person at the top needs to resign. That was the case in the past. For example, there's a relatively well-known letter that Dwight Eisenhower, as the commander of D-Day, had written in the event that things didn't go well. He had that letter written to say, I'm the responsible party for this. Thankfully, that letter was never published at the time because it was an enormous success. But that was an indication of, I think, how one who leads an institution should view these things. But that's been lost over the decades.
Are there particular plot points as you look back at history that you say, okay, this is what has led us to this place where we have so many leaders and institutions who are suspect, where a person stepping down from a position of power is seen as weakness, not an admission of wisdom or strength?
There was a political cartoon years ago, I don't even know where it was, of a burning house with the fire department there, and the homeowner is out front saying, "No, thanks, I'm a libertarian." And the point was, it doesn't matter what your ideological view is, you need the fire department when your house is on fire. I mean, there are a lot of factors behind institutional lack of trust, but I think one of those factors is not the failure of institutions, but the success of them. And so many of these institutions have been so successful that people start to take them for granted and can't imagine what life would be like without them. Jonah Goldberg has talked about how often we assume that our structure, liberal democracy and safety and security and all of these things just happen. When in reality, if you look back across human history, that is an extraordinary achievement. I think that not taking that seriously enough often leads to the kind of dismissal of the things that we really do need to exist.
So, Mike, when we read these headlines of failures within institutions, when we see these kind of failures within churches on a really granular level, what are some very practical thought processes, behaviors, disciplines that we could put into place so that we don't have a knee jerk reaction where we just throw the baby out with the bathwater, throw the institution out with a particular problem?
Well, I think one of the keys is to develop a good immune system for things like conspiratorial thinking. And this was one thing that you saw in the immediate aftermath that I think was a reflection of the toxic culture that we were in. On the right, you had people saying, oh, the Secret Service failed because it's the deep state trying to kill Donald Trump. And then on the left, you had people saying, oh, the whole thing was staged. This was all so that Donald Trump could get that photo op in front of the flag with the bloody ear. I would like to have been a fly on the wall at the campaign team meeting where they said, okay, you're going to turn your head and we're going to have this 20-year-old kid fire a bullet, but don't worry, he's just going to graze your ear. I just would love to have seen Trump's reaction to that. There's an absurdity to all of that that's extremely dangerous. But part of the reason people get conspiratorial is because in the absence of clarity, in the absence of meaning, you make up a story or you look for a story that makes sense of it. You look for a pattern that makes sense of sort of the whole. We have to embrace a certain amount of ambiguity. We also have to embrace the reality of human failure and incompetence. I mean, Hanlon's razor is this idea that you never attribute to malice what is best attributed to stupidity. When the reviews are all done, you're not going to find a whole lot of malice. You're going to find a whole lot of stupidity, incompetence, people assuming that whatever the problems were, somebody else was responsible for it other than them. So resisting the conspiratorial thinking, resisting those kind of polarizing enemy making, oh, let me blame it on the people that I don't like because that fits my worldview. And I think we have to be patient. I mean, again, people were crying for the head of the Secret Service to resign. It took about 8 days. We mentioned that Reagan's head of the Secret Service resigned when he was shot in 1981. That was 3 months later. It wasn't immediate that he resigned. Give it time for the reporting to happen, for the reviews to happen, for the stories to come out. And again, that comes back to as well to sort of our media diet, our media consumption. We're used to Twitter. We're used to social media. Something happens, we can go online and find out right away what it was. And when answers are slow in being forthcoming, we don't need to automatically assume the worst.
When you're on the outside and you're looking at failures of institutions, of course you've got 20/20 vision. So you can say, how could they have been so stupid? How could they have not seen this? But then when you're in it, you understand how those things happen. The other thing is that there's a fascinating phenomenon, I think, in terms of how Americans view institutions, which are competing against each other in a certain way. On the one hand, there is enormous lack of trust toward institutions. And yet, at the other hand, there are expectations that are superhuman that people have. Institutions are the product of human effort and human actions, and they're just not going to always work out well, and things are going to go wrong. So if you have a view toward institutions, which is they have to act practically perfect, and anytime that they don't, it plays into this template, which is that this is a conspiracy or that they fail all the time. It's not a good mix. And that feeds this larger mistrust. This is toxic stuff because if you can't trust institutions, you can't trust knowledge, you can't trust other people. It just gets very, very hard to operate as a country, as a free country in a democracy. Those are big issues. Those are big tasks. And you just have to deal with them an institution at a time, a day at a time, to try and rebuild the institutions, even as we all give thought to how do we reshape, both as Christians and non-Christians, the human sensibilities that can help heal the nation.
Whether it's restoring our denominations or governmental agencies or restoring our relationships, we certainly have a lot of work to do in this department. Pete, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. We will be right back. And we're back. Hey, listeners, if you like our show, be sure to subscribe so that you'll be notified of each new episode and tell your friends about us. Let's expand this circle of conversation. This week, Benjamin Netanyahu traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with U.S. officials and address a joint session of Congress. He came seeking support for Israel and their fight against Hamas on an invitation that was first offered over 2 months ago. In the meantime, tensions regarding the war in Gaza have risen, and the war has become even more deeply interwoven in American minds with particular political alliances. Joining us to parse out what's happening here is Chris Seipel, a familiar voice here at the Bulletin. Chris is the Senior Fellow for Comparative Religion at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He is a pioneer and innovator in relational diplomacy, sought after for his decades of experience and expertise regarding issues at the intersection of geopolitics, foreign policy, conflict resolution, and religion. Chris, welcome back to the Bulletin.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
So scan any set of headlines, and Chris, you will quickly discover that Benjamin Netanyahu is a complicated figure. Why is he here in the U.S. right now, and what does he hope to accomplish?
He is a complicated figure. He's here for the fourth time, or was here yesterday, which is the most of any foreign leader to ever address our Congress. So he commands respect across time and across administrations, across Republicans and Democrats. The purpose of this visit, I would say, was threefold. One, foremost, to speak to Iran and issue a very strong and clear red line about what they can and cannot do through their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Second, he wanted to speak to his own people. 70% want to replace him. And he needs to look like he is a statesman of the stature that he imagines himself to be across the past. And he wants to speak to the Americans. He still needs our arms and our intelligence, and he needs us to lead the alliance that stood against the missile attack back in April that Iran orchestrated. So he needs all those things. He's walking a tightrope, and we'll see how everybody responds from those three audiences.
We're recording this on Thursday, and news just arrived this morning that Israeli forces have retrieved the bodies of 5 hostages, where Israel is currently carrying out military strikes. And last month, Netanyahu seemed to indicate that he supported the basic elements of a phased ceasefire drill, one of which was the return of hostages. But since then, he seems to be dragging his heels, which has been a major frustration for families of the hostages. Why is that?
The only way to understand Netanyahu, in my opinion, is you have to put yourself in his shoes. And like any politician, they want to stay in power. He's made a deal with the devil with the far right religious parties in his country to form a coalition. And that coalition wants to continue to root out Hamas. The question is how, of course. How do you make Israel secure and safe into the future? And that coalition wants to reoccupy Gaza and parts of the West Bank. So I think his thinking is he wants to delay until a few days from now. That's when the Knesset goes on recess for 3 months, and that will give him more space to consider. It's 2 deals that he's thinking about, actually. The first deal is the hostage deal, and the second deal is his broader security framework that the Biden administration has been working on with Saudi. Theoretically, there would be more political flexibility with his own coalition to move closer to accomplishing those two things when the Knesset is in recession.
So, Mike, border security is a primary concern for Bibi, specifically the border between Egypt and Gaza, where Hamas has built these tunnel systems for both warfare and smuggling. Is it reasonable that Israel should have some role in policing that area, or do you think that's beyond the bounds of what they should be expected to control?
It all comes down to the question of as opposed to what. If the question is, should the border be in the hands of the ruling power of Gaza, which still is Hamas at this moment, should Israel have a say over it, or should it be wholly in the hands of Hamas and Egypt? I think the answer was fairly obvious simply because of what the last 8 months have proven. If there is an alternative coalition to oversee that border, there's an alternative ruling power that could rise up from among the Palestinian people. If there was some means of negotiating a ruling coalition around another Palestinian faction like Fatah, there's more of a reasonable argument to make for some kind of transition around the way this border is handled. But I think if you take Netanyahu out of it for a moment and you ask the Israeli people, regardless of who the leadership of the country was, the primary thing that they are going to ask for and push for is security at that border. Who can reliably police that border? What can be done? What kinds of reforms can be done inside of the ruling authorities of Gaza, whomever that may be, so that it doesn't result in the reconstruction of this tunnel network, the reconstruction of smuggling networks, and the opportunity for another terror action like the one that we saw on October the 7th. People are critiquing Netanyahu regularly for the fact that there's not a day after plan. And while I understand that critique, I think the challenge is there are very few good options for a day after plan. The idea of Israel sort of policing Gaza and reoccupying is unacceptable, both to Israelis who don't want to put their kids on the streets of Gaza in harm's way, and to Palestinians. The question is who goes in. There are interesting conversations about another coalition coming in, maybe part of this Saudi security agreement. But to date, that still seems like a bit of a fantasy. It's a no good options situation right now, as far as I can see it.
U.S. officials have been working on this potential alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel that would relax tensions and normalize their engagement with each other and also isolate Iran. Russell, do you think that these measures could actually work to turn down the heat in this region?
It has been clear from the very beginning that the Saudis are going to be key, that we have to have Arab voices that are able to speak into the conflict, especially with the diplomatic power that Saudi Arabia has, and to isolate Iran. I mean, the simple truth of it is, I think many of us have not been thinking much about Iran and the Iranian situation because there's so much else going on around the world. But if that emerges in a bad way, it will focus all of our attention immediately without any choice. So much of this is going to be done, as these things often are, in quiet, hidden away rooms where people are trying to establish trust with one another and come up with solutions. I don't know that we can see whether or not that's going to happen, but we can have hope and we can pray.
The ultimate irony of this whole thing is that the surrounding neighborhood does not want Hamas there and also feels threatened by Iran, but they don't have permission to speak into this because of their own street, because they're all frustrated with Israel and how the war has been conducted and this tremendous, unbearable loss of life in Gaza. And there's an argument about how a war can be fought for political objectives, but it's hard to fight for a political objective when you don't know what the day is after and no vision is presented. David Ignatius in the Washington Post was reporting yesterday that the UAE is a little fed up and they invited members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's team to the UAE, and they're going to be pushing their guy, Mohammed Dalan, who is perhaps the best of the least liked options going forward. But he is the person that people are comfortable enough, sufficient consensus to organize a force around. He used to run security forces, and that might be a good transition. What Ignatius was reporting in the Washington Post, which is interesting, there could be forces from Egypt and Qatar and UAE, but also maybe they mentioned a leading nation in Central Asia. And I think they said Indonesia as well. So if you had that kind of coalition from the Muslim majority world with the financial backing, that's a different conversation because everybody's exhausted. And there's a theory in conflict resolution about ripeness for resolution. There is a ripeness here because people can't take it anymore and they want it. And even I would say Hezbollah in Iran, everybody wants a break. Nobody wants anything else. We're almost at that point. And maybe when the Knesset goes into recession, something gets revealed.
So you talk about this ripeness, and I think about Air Wars, which is a British organization that assesses claims of civilian harm in conflicts. And they just released a new study stating that the Palestinian Ministry of Health death records from the first 17 days of the war are actually largely accurate. The New York Times reported that they were able to independently identify 3,000 names, most of which matched the ministry's list. And this is after only analyzing 350 of the Israeli airstrikes that occurred during those first 17 days. And when we think about ripeness for an ending to conflict, Mike, does knowing that the Gazan death count was so great at the beginning reshape how you think about Netanyahu's insistence on continuing the war despite desires for an end?
One of the important factors in thinking about the death count and thinking about the way the war unfolded is that there's a very significant difference between the way Israel fought the wars in the north and, for instance, the way they're fighting in Rafah right now and the way they've generally fought in the south. The IDF has briefed on the fact that they went in with one set of expectations for how to fight an army that's fighting in a tunnel network. And their strategy in the north was shock and awe. It was brutal. We've seen the images of what happened in the north. Their strategy changed pretty dramatically as they figured out methods, as they figured out ways of fighting in the south. So certainly, I think the number of civilian casualties at the beginning of the war was extremely high, but that ratio has changed pretty dramatically as the war has gone on. There's a fundamental issue here. Regardless of who's going to sort of take over authority in Gaza, the fact is that if the IDF pulls out and Sinwar and other Hamas leaders are able to come out of the tunnels into the streets, waving the Hamas flag and saying, we did it, we negotiated a deal where we got to survive, we got to go into Israel and kill 1,200 people. We've been bragging to Arab media for the last 9 months that October the 7th was the first of many attacks that we intend to carry out. If that's the way the war ends, then whomever else comes in after the IDF pulls out is going to be the target of terror attacks, violence, and whatnot from whatever remnants of Hamas are left. The rationale for finishing off Hamas is pretty strong. It's a war that nobody wants to continue because it's a brutal war. And this is where you have to understand that his strategy in this war is always to push it to this front, where international exhaustion and Israeli exhaustion leaves room for Hamas to survive another day. The tunnels are part of that strategy. The civilian death count is a part of that strategy. The hostages are a massive part of that strategy. Sinwar spent his decade in Israeli prisons studying Israeli society, studying Israeli history, studying international politics in these ways. And that informs all of this. When you hear the Israelis saying, we want the war to end, but we don't know how to end it without ending Hamas, that's why. That's the rationale.
Over 50 members of Congress publicly indicated that they would not attend Netanyahu's afternoon address. Many skipped the speech, notably Kamala Harris and J.D. Vance. Nancy Pelosi later tweeted that it was the worst presentation of any foreign dignitary who had been invited to address the Congress. Russell, how do you think the last 3 weeks of events in the U.S. have affected our nation's response to Bibi's visit?
You have the political considerations, for instance, for Kamala Harris, who is in the first 3 days of being the presumptive Democratic nominee, trying to take down the tensions within her own party over the question of Israel and Gaza and wanting to really move on from that particular controversy to have a unified Democratic convention. And then you add to it, I'm not sure that it's as much the political developments in the United States as some of it has to do with the political developments in Israel, because there were many members of Congress who felt as though the Netanyahu speech had less to do with Israel seeking the support of the United States than it was with Netanyahu shoring up his own constituency back home with a particular kind of rhetoric. So you had some discomfort even with people who are strongly supportive of Israel, not to mention the theatrics, for instance, of Rashida Tlaib holding up a sign that says war criminal during the speech, which was wholly inappropriate, not to mention the awful scenes of defacement of property and mistreatment of security personnel and others at Union Station right down the street from the Capitol. That's indicating that the tension levels that we have right now and the bad reactions to those tension levels are not going away.
Yair Rosenberg of The Atlantic criticized Netanyahu this week, saying, quote, his words tend to have few consequences beyond the immediate attention they attract. Chris, do you think that this visit is really just going to end up being all about political posturing, improving Bibi's brand on the world stage? Do you sense that he doesn't really want peace?
He wants to stay in power. The good part about his speech was he took us back to the day and we remembered what took place. That has been lost a little bit in our own discussions. He reminded us of the atrocities, of the hostages. It was fantastic to show these soldiers of Ethiopian descent and to remind people historically and scripturally that Israel is not a colonial settler state and to warn Iran. Those things needed to be said and be reminded. So that part's good. But, with Bibi, there's no apology, there's no humility, and there is no possibility that he might have been wrong. This happened on his watch. The Houthi drone last week that hit Tel Aviv, his watch. How is that even possible? And there is tremendous concern within his own national security framework about how long he can be there with credibility. And the population is 70% want him gone, and they want an election. So it's going to get chalked up to politics, of course, and it will fade given all the stuff that we're focused on. And I'm just very curious what kind of pressure the Saudis and the UAE are going to do. UAE is a function of the Abraham Accord to say, look, we need this to end. Because the question Israel has to ask itself is, are you safer than you were on 6 October? And in the immediate sense, yes, because Hamas cannot attack me. But I've just produced the next generation of terrorists, and I have produced a neighborhood that does not want to work with me. And there are other countries in the Muslim majority world like Egypt and Indonesia that want to open up this tech trade and everything else. So he's got to transition out of this purely tactical day-to-day into at least an operational and strategic idea about how things move forward. That actually is key, I think, to his longevity. But right now, I think he's going to live and die by the tactical sword, and people are going to say enough is enough. Israeli people.
Well, it's been almost 300 days since the war began in Israel and Gaza, and it's become so politically charged here in the U.S. that I think folks are starting to feel exhausted. They're worn down by the headlines of the last 9 months. They're ready to say out of sight, out of mind. And yet, we will all sit in church on Sunday and pray for our communities, our church, and our world. Russell, how do we keep engaging in this topic without becoming callous or experiencing compassion fatigue? What do we pray for on Sunday morning?
Part of the result of the kind of information overload that we have right now is that people do want to move very quickly on from whether it's Ukraine war, whether it's the situation in the Middle East, to have this almost unspoken assumption that this ought to be like a scripted drama that ends within a prearranged kind of season, but that's not what real life is. I think what we need to have is a recognition that we are able to pray even if we don't know specifically what we're praying for. So you don't have to know here's what the peace resolution ought to ultimately look like in Gaza to pray for peace and justice in the Middle East. As Paul says in Romans 8, often we are praying not knowing how we should pray and trusting the Holy Spirit to lead us that way. We can continue to do that. I think that as we do that, we're then shaped and formed into the people who ought to be able to care. Sometimes I think we ought to care enough about something adequately and then pray. Often it works the other way. Once we start praying about something, then we start caring about it and being informed about it.
The other thing that we can certainly pray for on very practical levels, regardless of whatever theory we might hold to as to how this conflict should end, something every American ought to keep top of mind is the fact there's still 8 American citizens somewhere in the tunnels of Gaza or being held captive essentially as like domestic slave labor in Gaza. As Americans, the fact that these eight people, men and women, are not household names, I think is a tragedy. We should be praying for them. We should be praying for their safety. We should be praying for their safe return. We should be praying for the peace of the region as well.
We need to pray for leaders and be grateful for leaders like Ambassador Bill Burns, who has been doing incredible work, and Blinken too, on Ukraine and on Israel-Palestine. We pray for their stamina, for their wisdom, for their discernment to keep bringing people to the table. So as Christians, our definition of success is obedience. We're just called to keep praying and to be a presence. That is the key. How do we be a presence in these communities in America? How do we be a presence as we steward our American citizenship in a thoughtful way? And how do we steward our own election process? It's about to get really nasty. And we have to live out the command to love our neighbor and our enemy now more than ever, because there's a national security implication downstream. People watch us. And if they think that we're not capable of acting to do some good in the world because the world needs a deterrent sometimes, because nature abhors a vacuum and people will fill it if there's not a credible threat like the aircraft carriers that Biden rightfully sent to the region to prevent Hezbollah from thinking of anything, like the warning that we have given to Russia if they kill one NATO soldier or one American soldier in Poland. It's a very clear warning. That helps stability. That helps peace. So we pray for all of those things as we go forward in terms of presence and in terms of how we steward our own election process.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Listeners, thank you for joining us this week on The Bulletin. We hope that this episode finds you better equipped to understand the headlines and talk about them as a winsome witness to the gospel. We will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.